We're going to start. We're going to start this morning with stepping back again. This time in the old world, but with this the exciting, to me, the exciting new kind of research, really in action. Since our first speaker is someone who's in the thick of it, who just finished his PhD here. And that's that long name, ancient and Mediterranean stuff.
It's got a lot of words, yeah. Covering all the bases.
In that part of the world that we all think of as the heart of the current civilization, in paleobotany, and that where archaeology and science meet, and we can see what's really happening right now. And so he is Alan Farahani, and he has just finished his doctorate here, but he's now about to start a postdoctoral program at UCLA, right? And we'll let him go down south, but the delight of that is he's also moving, so he understands how.
So thank you, everyone. Wonderful. Very happy to be here today. Thank you all for being here so early in the morning to hear about a topic that I hope will serve as a wake-up call, maybe not necessarily in the way that I intended, but will hopefully either perk you up or lull you nonetheless. But first, I'd really like to thank Michelle for her invitation to speak today and to share my research with everyone. I'm going to cover a lot of material as quickly as I can. So by necessity, that might mean that I'm going to skip over some of the slides. So if I do, when we get to the Q&A, I can, of course, go over anything that I've missed. So today, the topic of the presentation is discussing the archaeology of agricultural production in the ancient Near East. And I'm very specifically picking the past 7,000 years here. And so first, I'm going to begin by explaining why agricultural production in a series dedicated to foodways. Now, you're going to hear a lot of great things, and you've heard a lot of great things about foodways. You know that it's a complex issue. There are a lot of moving parts. I'm not going to do it injustice by heaping yet another definition of what I think foodways are, or why I think the entanglement of people and cuisine and everything that goes with it is very important. I'll address bits of it, but I'm not going to delve into that. But I will talk about specifically agricultural production and why I think it's such an important and interesting issue. But just a bit of biographical information about myself, if anyone was interested at all. So you heard that I just recently was awarded my doctorate here in an interdisciplinary archaeology program. And I did my undergraduate degree at Rutgers University in linguistics, of all things, computational linguistics. So I've had a very variegated and very interesting path through the academy. So as I've noted, let's see if I can get this to work. Here we go, first snag, there we go. The issue of foodways and thinking about food in the past, especially what some will call the distant past, but to me it's actually not that distant. I was once in a seminar with somebody who worked in the Lower Paleolithic, so that's 2.2 million years to, I think, 25,000 years ago, and someone said, oh, but I study such and such issue in the Upper Paleolithic 28,000 years ago, and she said, current events. So for me, for many, the distant past is something like 7,000 years ago, but in the profession, it's very, very, very recent. And I'm actually very interested in this, what is considered to be geologically a very recent phenomenon. But food and the issue of food in the past and the way that it affects people's lives, both in all forms, production, distribution, and consumption, is increasingly becoming a topic of study, especially in the area of the world known as the Near East, the Middle East, which I'll define in a moment. And you could see here some representative publications in the ways that individuals, practitioners, archaeologists specifically, are beginning to think about this issue. But rather than focus on the food, which is the final product which people sit around and enjoy, which you're enjoying right now on the table, my interest is in the way that that food is first produced, and a very specific kind of production, which is agriculture, which, as we know, is It's a dominant form of producing food today, but by no means the only one. People have devised a lot of very interesting ways of producing food, hunting and gathering among them. We give them simple terms, but they actually encode very complex ways of life for people all around the world. So the way that I'd like to approach that is by first providing a quick background and orientation to the issues of more or less where we are today in terms of knowledge about agricultural production and more or less its origins in the Near East. Then I'm going to talk about, as Michelle said, some of the archaeological methods for identifying ancient agricultural production. So these are more or less the contemporary and then future directions of methodology that archaeologists use to actually identify things that have happened many thousands of years ago. And then finally, I'd like to provide a case study of this in action for, again, for me, current events, the past 3,000 years, of more or less a distilled version of my dissertation research in West Central Jordan, where I investigated this issue from about 1000 BCE to 1500 CE, to more or less on the cusp of the early modern period. So this is essentially the outline of how I'd like to approach this issue. Hopefully I'll be able to get to most of this, all of this, a part of this, but you can tell me what's more interesting so I can speed it up or slow it in the spirit of DVR and all of modern technology. Our patience is limited in our time, so is our time. But first I'd like to begin with the question of why agriculture? Out of all the topics that one could pick, you know, in the common, the way that the media portrays archaeologists, it's usually, of course, Indiana Jones, or something very sensationalized, wondrous gold, silver, monuments, and then no one thinks agriculture, fields, backbreaking labor, irrigation canals. Those are usually not often thought of, but for me, that's actually one of the most interesting aspects of understanding people's lives in the past. Not just the sensational, but the everyday, the things that all of us are, not that our everyday lives are interesting, it seems that television is trying to make us forget it, but at the same time, I think that that's actually one of the most pressing questions that archaeologists are interested in today, is the issue of everyday life. And so agriculture, I'm just going to quote agroecologist John Vandermeer here, is not planting a seed and harvesting a crop. Agriculture is making a contract among people using seeds and harvest to do so. And so what I think Professor Vandermeer is really getting at here is the multiple factors that are contingent on agriculture. And here you could see a diagram of how I think this works. We have things like climate and geology, plants and non-human animals, their ecology, biodiversity, all of the biological aspects of plants and non-human animals that we've domesticated, the soil that we interact with, and then also human society. And so all of these are actually interrelated and influence each other. They create each other. The kinds of economies that we set up drive demands, and those demands are for certain products, and those production schemes invariably inform all of these other facets. But the kinds of things that we can also produce are also in some ways constrained by the availability of water, by the quality of soil, by the kinds of plants that are available. So in this way, I think agriculture is an extremely interesting way to think about the past, because it sits at the nexus of all of these overlapping factors. And indeed today, being in California, we can actually see how those politics play out in a drought in a very real way, especially for our friends in the Central Valley right now. So these changes in this adoption of this agricultural way of life, as I mentioned, isn't just about the plants, but actually about people's relationships to make these plants. And so what we're looking at here is a site in northern Syria known as Jerf el Ahmar. Dates to about 8,000 BCE. And what you see here are a series of structures that were not only people's homes, but granaries and ceremonial spaces. So it's a really interesting insight, or I think it's very exemplary of the kinds of interlocked changes that all happened at the same time. It's not just that people started producing new kinds of foods, but it also had ripple effects on every aspect of their daily lives, down to storage and the way that people have to actually coordinate labor among themselves. So even changing people's social relations in order to produce this food. Another reason that I think agriculture is a very interesting and important perspective is that what we can see here, do I have a pointer? Yes, I do. Yeah, there it is. Great. Something that is almost unique to the Middle East is the fact that around 7,000 BP in particular, agriculture becomes one of the most dominant modes of food production in this span of time all the way to the present. So we have a very, very, very long record of agricultural production and changes in human life that more or less were dependent on this mode of production. So sort of unique. There are many other places in the world that I'll show that also employ this, but the Middle East or the Near East, from about 7,000 BP to the present, you can see increasing dependence on agriculture gives us a long-term record with which we can actually see these changes play out. And as archaeologists interested in long-term change, this is a very interesting place to enjoy this kind of research. So just really quickly, I wanted to point out, here we are in the Near or Middle East. I actually prefer the term Southwest Asia because one might ask what the region is in the middle or to the east of. But it's a term with a lot of baggage and a lot of history, and it's also the one that's the most commonly used and very hard to change. But for the most part, I'll try to use actually Southwest Asia rather than the Near East. But here we are roughly in this area here, bounded by the contemporary countries of Turkey, Iran, and then to some extent, depending on who you are, Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, so as I mentioned, again, in looking at the periodization of the different kinds of cultural horizons, so to speak, that we see in the Middle East, in Southwest Asia, from the Neolithic, what we see is that agriculture actually overlaps and predates some of the other really big transitions that some groups in the area practice and were part of, which includes urbanization and writing. So actually, through studying agriculture, we can actually also see the effects of these other social changes as well. So again, a really interesting way to approach this issue. So really quickly, before I begin talking about agriculture, I just wanted to have a clarification of terms here, because I don't know how many of you are farming on the side in addition to your very light duties as educators. Yes, exactly, that's what I was waiting for. Okay, so here, and in thinking about this issue, archaeologists, especially those who are interested in the issue of domestication, distinguish cultivation, which is the assistance of plants in their propagation and reproduction, and hence increasing plant fitness. And those cultivation not necessarily relate to domesticated varieties. So for instance, tilling ground around strawberries in order to encourage their growth, even if they're wild varietals, as I did as a kid growing up on the East Coast, pruning plants around it to make sure that there's no competition. That's a form of cultivation, but the plants can actually be wild. Domestication, on the other hand, is when people consciously and continually select traits in plant cultivars or different types through multiple generations. So that's when people actually start to intervene in the plant's reproductive cycle. And agriculture is more or less the synthesis of the two of these. It's systematic and continuous human cultivation, harvesting, storage, and careful and conscious propagation of domesticated plant varieties. So oftentimes you'll see the word control used, but that violates some pretty basic laws of thermodynamics. Most of the time, and a lot of the farmer interviews that I'll hear that I've actually been involved with, what people are doing is very carefully and consciously creating the proper conditions for these plants to propagate. And that's why, if you've ever noticed, especially how lovingly gardeners will tend to their plants in very interesting ways that are deserving of ethnographies of their own, people become very attuned to how these plants reproduce and assist that reproduction, which is, I think, a better way of thinking about it than domination or control. And some of these changes in domestication that we see around 8,000 BC, really 7,000 BC, that will actually have effects on people's relationships. One of the big ones is the loss of seed dispersal. So plants can no longer actually disperse seeds without human intervention. Now, plants don't know that people are intervening. That would be very interesting sci-fi show. But without human intervention, specifically in the form of sowing, these plants can no longer reproduce. And they lose their grain dispersal aids. And here we can actually see these differences between wild and then domesticated varieties of here. This is wild and domesticated wheat. And an increase in grain size, and that's really big. That's very important. So people are actually making sure that these plants can't reproduce by themselves, so they're continually selecting and reproducing plants that can't reproduce without human intervention, and concomitantly selecting for really big grains for various uses. And you can see here, actually, there are a number of other features biologically within the plant that correlate to what's called this domestication syndrome. And the same kind of odd term is used for animals as well, domesticated animals. And in fact, the loss of this seed dispersal and grain dispersal aids actually really changes people's relationships. So it's not just the biology, but this interrelationship of the biology of the plants, as I showed you in that first sort of infographic, and people's relationships. Because people have to now actively intervene in these plants' reproduction, they have to start coordinating amongst themselves en masse in order to affect the planting of these seeds. And in order to do that, that's actually going to require changes in the way that people organize socially. And so parts of the processing chain, like harvesting, threshing, winnowing, and then even storage, all require new kinds of structures, new kinds of organizations, new kinds of relationships between people. So agriculture, not only, the domestication of plants not only changes these biological aspects, morphological aspects of the plants, but even the people's activities, daily activities in relating to that. And those have really long-term effects, and we see that in our metaphors every day, right? Separating the chaff from the wheat, and the enormous quantity of agricultural metaphors that even enter our everyday speech. So it's not just that these are far removed from our experiences, but actually even trickle down into the way that we describe and understand the world. So it's had a lot of effects. So very quickly, one of the original ideas surrounding plant domestication, agriculture in particular, was that it sort of arose and I unfortunately don't have time to go into the very interesting question as to potentially how, but it arose in this area known as the Fertile Crescent, which I will tell you why I do not like that term, and why it's actually, because of archaeological research, it's increasingly being shown to be problematic, as I'll show you. But in this area around 9,000, 8,000 years ago, at the same time that people were domesticating or experimenting with the selective propagation of these plants, they were also doing the same thing with animals. So more or less at the same time, it seems like there was goats, cattle, sheep, pig, all along with very, very, very many kinds of plants. People were experimenting in their selective reproduction, and eventually this lifeway, and this is what's so interesting about this, spreads over the majority of the Mediterranean basin. So these social changes, all of these changes that come with agriculture, don't just become confined to this part of the world, but it seems to be adopted by very many people in the area. And in fact, this model of can be extended to almost all the world. So here you're looking at actually all the primary domestication centers of plants worldwide. So in the past, there's this very powerful narrative of the Middle East producing the plants that we know and love, domestication, then it leads to urbanization, and then it leads to the miracle of Western civilization. As if nowhere else in the world was domesticating plants. But we can actually see, because of the archaeological research and methods that I'm going to detail in a moment, that all over the world, at different times, people were experimenting with and also domesticating plants. Things like sunflower, maize, lima beans, all New World products that obviously didn't exist before the Columbian Exchange in the 16th century. Things like chili and potatoes, even tomatoes, of course, the one that everyone loves to point out, and something like Foodways before the 17th century was virtually unknown, or 16th century unknown in Italian cuisine, but now it's been indigenized. It's a New World plant par excellence. Nonetheless, it's very clear that at the same time, these are domestication centers. So we could see here in the Middle East this massive radiation of all these different plant types that I mentioned, 7,000 BC, radiating outward, but also what you'll hear about this phenomenon in East Asia, in the Sahel, in South America, and so on. So our perspective on domestication has also changed worldwide, and the way in which the Middle East has fit into this for the past 7,000 years. So I've given you a very, 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 very quick overview of sort of what we know about domestication, about agricultural production, its origins, 8,000, 7,000 BCE, roughly in an arc that I just showed you in Southwest Asia, emanating outwards sort of in lockstep with domesticated animals. Okay, so that's the story as we have it. So the question is, how do we know about this? So you've taken it for granted that I'm not making this up. That's good. Thank you. But the actual methodology, the day-to-day sort of brute methods that we employ in the laboratory for constructing these scenarios are very important. And they've actually changed quite radically. Through their change, we've actually learned a lot. And it's changed our perspectives in turn, for instance, on this idea that agriculture starts just in one place in the Middle East and then radiates outwards. And I'll show you how that works. So most archaeological research that's interested in questions of agriculture, for instance, falls under the larger research umbrella of environmental archaeology. And that's essentially my specialization. Environmental archaeology, as you see here, one definition aims to uncover the ecology of human communities. So sort of like, again, that plot that I showed you in the beginning with agriculture sitting at the nexus, we're employing all of these different kinds of disciplines and sub-disciplines, everything from molecular genetics to soil science, paleoecology, archaeology, to create a more holistic picture of what life was like. People, the ecology of people. So not just the thoughts that they have in their head, but the physical world that they interact with, the soil, the smell, the water, the plants, the animals, everything together, how people fit in to that. And so the methodology that I actually utilize, and the one that I'm going to talk to you about today, actually the keystone of understanding, one of the keystones of understanding past vegetation is paleoethnobotany. So paleoethnobotany is the study of past cultures by an examination of human populations' interactions with the plant world. Now, it's very distinct actually from the European tradition, which is known as archaeobotany, because archaeobotany refers to the recovery and identification of plants by specialists regardless of discipline. So in this, archaeobotanists are often more interested in the plants themselves, whereas paleoethnobotanists, and that's what that ethno is, I always show this. This is from Jurassic Park. Ellie Sattler jumps into dung. Now, while I've actually interacted with more dung than I've ever thought that I would in my life, both on the human and non-human level as an archaeologist, she was actually a paleobotanist. She was interested in the plants themselves, their evolution, how they fit in to phylogenetics, the study of evolutionary relationships. That's important knowledge for any paleoethnobotanist, but paleoethnobotanists are primarily interested in the ethno, the people. So plants as a tool to understand people's interactions with themselves. So how people are using plants, not only for things like subsistence, keeping themselves alive, but also for social ends, rituals, ceremonies, events, cuisine, all kinds of different facets. So that's the big difference between paleoethnobotany and its cousin, archaeobotany. And yes, I have actually dived into a giant pile of cow dung before. I did a study on trying to see what kinds of vegetative material survives ruminant guts. It's really incredible how many papers paleoethnobotanists publish about this. There's actually a drawer in the lab that's just labeled dung, and it's really, it's surprisingly not as smelly as you'd think. So there are a few different aspects to paleoethnobotanical research. I'm not going to go over them in individual detail. The most important is that all of this starts with research design. There's usually a very broad question, such as, are there certain plants associated with certain kinds of social organizations? And then that leads to things like, okay, well, we have to establish specific methodologies for collecting remains, identifying, quantifying, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a very specific process that most paleoethnobotanists join in their research. And there are several different methodologies that I'm going to discuss right now very briefly. And this is like the state of the art, so to speak, as if such a thing could exist for archaeologists. For people who study technological change, they are surprisingly immune to any of it in the present. So, but it's changing pretty rapidly. So there are 5 different methodologies. I'm going to spend most of my time on what's called macrobotanical research. That's my area of expertise, and to some extent, anthracological. And then I'll detail the other methods and the sorts of things that we can learn from them that these other methodologies or these other kinds of data, kinds of information don't necessarily provide. So macrobotanical remains are essentially archaeological plant remains that are visible to the naked eye or with the aid of a low-power microscope. So what you can see here, these are actually about 2,500-year-old emmer wheat grains. And so these are the sorts of things that paleoethnobotanists are looking for. And these aren't the only plant parts. It's not just seeds. If you're really lucky, if you work in Egypt, the joke is that if you work among Near Eastern archaeologists is that Egyptian archaeology is taking a leaf blower and then putting it over the sand and then finding whole garlic cloves, which is something that's kind of, it's unknown. I work in Jordan, and other areas, but it's not too far away. We don't find those kinds of things. Most of what paleoethnobotanists find is carbonized. They're burnt plant remains from all different kinds of the, parts of the plant. Seeds, sometimes the stems, the chaff, which will be very important as I'll show in a moment. So these are essentially the main categories. These are the things that people like myself are looking for in the field. And one of the questions that we always ask ourselves is, why do we find burnt plant remains in the ground anyway? And so we spend a lot of time actually studying contemporary people, the way that they process and use different kinds of plant remains. You can see here this hearth. So there are different models for thinking about, well, how is it that, why am I finding burnt wheat seeds? They could be accidents from cooking, they could be accidents from processing, milling, they could be from the actual processing of grain itself. Here you see winnowing, they're separating the wheat from the chaff, as it turns out. So that's one of the questions that paleoethnobotanists think a lot about. And also, these are real archaeological specimens from my research. This is wheat, and these are barley grains. You can actually learn something about, from these carbonized seeds themselves, something about the kinds of things that happened to them, and therefore the kinds of things that people were doing. For instance, you could see in this barley grain that starch is actually exploding out of it, which means that it was subjected to probably a covered environment that was high fire. So there was some sort of very intense fire, probably cooking episode for this barley grain. We could also see this is a lot of acid pitting, and this is actually a smushed grain from a floor. So it's pretty clear that this is probably from an accident. Somebody was processing some grain, it fell out, it got lost on the surface, and then it was just trampled on. So it's a little detailed, but it actually brings you down to the level of people in the everyday, something that you wouldn't expect necessarily from looking at a barley seed. But there it is. So the way that paleoethnobotanists collect this information is in the field is by taking what are called flotation samples. Here we just putting dirt inside of a bag, and this is from my field site, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. We use all different kinds of statistical sampling methodologies to establish how many samples we're going to take, where we're going to take them. This is inside of a room that we'll revisit momentarily. And obviously, the kinds of samples that you take are determined by preservation. If you work in Egypt, where all you have to do is blow on the dirt from 10 feet away and garlic cloves show up, well then you'll use something a little bit different. Most paleoethnobotanists employ what's known as flotation. So it just starts by taking dirt, putting it inside of a known quantity of dirt. We have calibrated sort of instruments to see how many liters of sediment we're collecting. And then we actually put it through this beautiful device that I've spent more time with than my partner cares to admit. But this is a flotation machine. So there's a mesh suspended inside of this tank. Then there's a decanter with a trap here. The sediment is put into the tank. Those remains whose specific gravity is less dense than water, most of the time they're carbonized, will actually float to the top, come down the trap, and then get caught here in this fine chiffon. And then everything else will sink. Yes, actually, this is headscarf material. And so Jordan is a Muslim majority country, and I go in and usually buy reams of headscarf from the headscarf store, which always gets a lot of quizzical eyebrows from the retailer. But it's good business, so no questions asked. So I take this fine headscarf material, and this will actually collect most of the botanical material of interest, and this will collect all kinds of very small artifacts. There are really cool things in here that I'll show you that come out. So again, here we've got two field school students, one from the University of Liverpool and one actually former UC Berkeley undergraduate, operating the flotation machine. This is what the heavy fraction looks like, and that's what the light fraction looks like. So all those carbonized botanical remains actually all start in this nondescript headscarf. So that's flotation. And then it leads to laboratory analysis, many hundreds of hours, taking these light fractions, looking through their contents, and this is essentially what they look like, and then identifying and taking out all of their remains. Now I should say that this flotation methodology is actually very recent. Again, very recent being 1970. Think again, archaeologically, 1970s. That's like practically yesterday. The number of studies that we can see that utilize this flotation method of taking dirt and dumping it into this tank. Before 1970, flotation was practically non-existent. What we're seeing here is the number of studies just for the Near East, pre-ceramic only, so just maybe 1,000-year span of time. The number of studies for the Neolithic. In 1970, there were less than 10. As of 2005, there are more than 70 that utilize macrobotanical remains. And this has completely transformed the discipline. The fact that practitioners are employing flotation on a wide scale at sites all over the region is radically transforming our perception of agricultural production, and I'll show you how. Nonetheless, and this is the point of my talk, if we look at the number of studies published, so these are studies that paleoethnobotanists are reporting. I went to the site, I collected a bunch of dirt samples. Here are the plants that I found. And if we look at the time periods to which they correlate, so remember about 8,000, 7,000 years ago, origins of agriculture, we see a lot of studies. Obviously, that's question of huge interest, origins of agriculture. It gets you the money. Yes, it does. And then we see in this sort of trend a slow decline. So this group right here is around the origins of urbanism. So that's another big one. Gets you lots of money because it puts you on the TV and people like that. So you can see here there are a number of studies. And then for the past 4,000, almost 5,000 years, there's a quick drop off. So the past 5,000 years are practically unknown in the Middle East in terms of agricultural production, as if nothing has changed, right? And so what we'll see is actually that this lacuna, this sort of lack of data that's generated, even though we've got a lot, now we know a lot about the origins of agriculture, now we know a lot about, well, more, I should say, about origins of urbanism, there's still a lot of room for the past 5,000 to 7,000 years. It sounds like an incredible span of time, and it is. So I think that's really where the frontier of research is really going to be in more recent time. And so just to quickly show you one of the ways that flotation has actually changed our perception of agricultural production. As I mentioned, initially there was a core hypothesis where it was imagined that people in one area domesticated plants around 8,000, 7,000 years ago, and it was so amazing that everyone else was irresistibly drawn to it from all around this region, from roughly the area of southwest Iran to the Levant around here, and that essentially it was diffused out. People were helplessly overwhelmed by the wonder and spectacle of working year-round, all day, tilling the earth, irrigating, harvesting, storing, fretting over the... that was what was previously the paradigm, the hypothesis known as the core hypothesis. But recently that's changed because of flotation. So this is a very recent paper from the journal Science where they report actually some of the earliest domesticated type species from a site in southwest Iran. And what's very interesting about this is, if you recall, I said there are a lot of diagnostic features, changes in plants as soon as people start intervening in their reproduction. One of them is a change, what we can see here, this is the chaff. These are the nodes, the sort of like little bits that hold in the grain itself. And what we can see is that there's a kind of scar on it. And what the authors noted is that the scar, and these are SEM photographs, on this rachis or chaff remain, they're diagnostic. You can actually tell the difference between a wild and a domesticated variety. And what they found is the earliest domesticated varieties of this emmer wheat here much earlier than they had ever imagined. And what's important is that it was actually contemporaneous with the earliest domestication sites elsewhere. So what it means is that at the same time that people were experimenting with plant domestication here, they were also experimenting with it over here. So it was simultaneous. It seems like there were many different areas of this region where people were more or less contemporaneously experimenting with this new kind of production. So it's a move away from the inevitable march of progress where one area creates this great new thing that then is transported everywhere, to a more nuanced perspective where we can actually begin to see the ways in which at the local level people were experimenting with, again, this new kind of lifeway. So very quickly, I'm going to skip over these so I can get to my case study. But in addition to macrobotanical, and I'm going to share these slides so you don't have to worry about writing this down furiously, but there's also study of wood charcoal, the kinds of trees that people were harvesting and burning. That's something that I actually also utilize as well. It gives provides a lot of information as to the local vegetation that's available, because a lot of trees are great indicator species for the local ecology, and also the kinds of preferred woods. Some woods burn out better than others, et cetera, et cetera. So anthracology is a big subdiscipline. Probably the cutting edge right now are microbotanical methods. So these are methods that you actually need a high-powered microscope for. They're these mineralized bodies formed of opaline silica that form inside of plant cells through their naturally drawing up nutrients from the soil in their xylem. The silica gets deposited in these cells, and because it's inorganic, we can actually utilize chemical methods in the soil to extract these phytoliths or these plant rocks. And so if you think about the macrobotanical remains I showed, those are actually carbonized seeds. They're very fragile. And if you don't have the right conditions, and when I showed you all those like pitted seeds and smush seeds, if you don't have the right conditions, they won't preserve. Because these are inorganic silicates, they preserve very well for thousands of years. And this is really the cutting edge. It's a sort of similar process. Essentially what happens is there's a certain amount of ambient silica in the soil. It gets drawn up by the plant and inadvertently it was thought inadvertently deposited. It might actually have, there might be an evolutionary reason why it does this, but silica actually starts forming inside of its cell walls. And so the silica essentially just takes the shape of that cell wall. And so what we can do is we can actually see that they form very specific kinds of shapes. And this is a rice phytolith, for instance, Japanese rice. And so we can actually use this to identify plants that were previously almost impossible to find using macrobotanical methods alone. So for instance, grain and phytoliths were used to extend maize domestication in Mexico back to the early 9th millennium BP. So that's before present, so that's 9,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, which is a huge change. Another big advantage of microbotanical methods is that you can collect plant remains from things that previously were impossible. For instance, we can actually now collect dental calculus. There's this great TEDx talk that says, don't brush your teeth, because later on in the future, archaeologists will extract all the grime that was in your teeth and be able to learn what you ate. The same is actually done for coprolites or human feces as well. So you could see it's a very glamorous lifestyle. We'll be on the E network before you know it. But because of dental conditions in the past, we can actually extract calculus from people's teeth and then extract starch remains, like starchy foods. We can actually extract starch remains to see exactly what people were eating up until the time of their passing. So it's really changed the field in terms of the resolution of information that we can actually derive from every every manner of information that we have at our disposal. And finally, Palynology, which I think you'll hear about or have heard about, which is the study of archaeological pollen. It's usually extracted from alluvial environments. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Essentially, cores are taken from very wet areas, as you can see here, and a lot of my friends who do this have really great stories about being in rafts, all kinds of really like Monty Python-ish things happening while trying to shoot these cores down. And so these cores are, you get a very, very large sedimented record because it's laminated. Sediments keep accumulating directly on top of one another. You actually get a record of all the ambient pollen that was in the air. And if you can, and this, I think the lesson today's, if there's any message that I'm going to sort of impart, it's patience. The hundreds of hours counting little seeds, and the hundreds of hours of going through each little centimeter slice, counting all the pollen grains. And someone has to do this, and thanks to their laborious efforts, we can actually create these charts that show the relative frequency of different kinds of plants through time. So for instance, here we have olive in this earlier period, it's around 300 BCE, and we can actually see it spike and then decline. So we can actually see really long-term and large-scale trends in certain kinds of plants. And that's actually also really revolutionized our perspective on agricultural production. Using all of these methods together is obviously sort of the holy grail of research. And each one of them gives you a different insight that is not necessarily provided by the other. So you can look at things like the landscape, using pollen. You can look at people's diets using phytoliths via dental calculus. You can see the kinds of plants that they were producing using macrobotanical methods, and even the kinds of wood that they were burning, what vegetation was available using wood charcoal. So using all of this, we can actually get a fairly representative picture of plant production and use in the past. All right, so I'm going to conclude my presentation today with a real-life application of all the sort of components that I've shown you. So in part one, the background to agricultural production, it's a pretty big change for people's lives in this part of the world. It's exported to almost all of Europe by about 7,000 to 6,000 years ago. It's exported to Central Asia, North Africa, simultaneously. We're not necessarily simultaneously, but people elsewhere all over the world who are experimenting with this very weird sort of practice of directly intervening into reproducing plants. And then I've also shown you all the different kinds of methodologies that paleoethnobotanists use in terms of plant recovery. And so now I'd like to show you some of my research in central Jordan, thinking about that problem that I talked about, that we know actually very little about the past 5,000 years in terms of agricultural production, an assumption that really nothing has changed, when really nothing could be further from the truth, as we'll see. So again, just to bring us back to Southwest Asia, I'm going to focus on a particular part of Southwest Asia known as the Levant, which comprises the following contemporary countries here. And more specifically, I'm going to look at a plateau just east of the Dead Sea, a site known as Dhiban. It's very important for its mention in the Hebrew Bible. It's in the contemporary Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And you could see here that it's a kidney bean-shaped site. It's what's known as a tell. It's formed through successive human occupation. So essentially, it's like people just living on top of one another, which is what downtown Oakland's become. Just moving out at the right time. So what we get is actually, because at various intervals through time, people would essentially demolish or run over all the architecture on the top of on this site and then build new architecture. And they would do it successively to the point where this is actually a huge artificial mound that sticks out on the landscape. So here we are. We're between these two very, very large canyons. The Mujib is called Jordan's Grand Canyon. And what's very interesting about this site, and you could actually see some of the architecture, is that it's been settled, and these are all radiocarbon dates, which unfortunately I don't have time to go over, but they're absolute dates. So these are all radiocarbon dates. And what they show is that the site's been settled from about 1000 BCE, so about 3,000 years ago, all the way up until the contemporary community today. So no settlement before agriculture. So it looks like people started settling there only after all of those big changes that I talked about, those big social changes related to agriculture took place. And so I was particularly interested in the ways in which two specific moments in time, which I wish we had more time to go into, the effects of two different kinds of polities or political bodies, how they affected people's local lives in terms of the kinds of agriculture that they practice. So this is a really different question from like origins of agriculture, domestication, but I'm actually utilizing the same kinds of methodologies that someone would use to study that question 8,000 years ago. I'm using it to look at a question from between 3,000 years ago to 500 years ago. And so what makes the site also very interesting is the amount of rainfall. Considering that we're in drought, this is a very, very pertinent topic. On average, that site in central Jordan receives about 256 millimeters a year, which is practically nothing. But as anybody who works in ag knows, averages are pretty much meaningless because in one given year, we have over 400 millimeters of rain. The next year can be hyper-arid, almost 100. And so this is all historical precipitation data, 1960 to the present. It's a very dry place. So it doesn't seem like the kind of place that you would necessarily live for 3,000 years, especially when you have to grow crops that are very water hungry. So one of my questions was, how did people essentially do this before large-scale mechanized irrigation? How was this achieved? And what sort of changes took place? So as I mentioned, it's been occupied over the past 3,000 years, and that's really evident in the landscape today. A considerable portion of my research, being part of the paleoethnobotany, is actually doing a lot of botany as well. So these are all the shrubs that you see here are from one species of plant. That's it. It's completely dominating this hillside. So we actually have in terms of the biodiversity of vegetation, a degraded landscape. A lot of that is probably due to actually human interaction with the landscape. And we can actually see this from a picture that I took standing on the archaeological site. And you can see this topography right here is all artificial. That's all from people living to an extent where they're like creating a miniature canyon. But you can see actually that it's almost completely treeless. The only trees that are in the landscape are managed by people. So essentially, this landscape has become, in every way, a human landscape. Even the vegetation that's on the landscape today is directly or indirectly related to people, to agriculture specifically for the past 3,000 years and beyond. And we can even just see that today in the contemporary landscape. Now, the two time periods that I was interested in, 600 CE, so we're looking here, here's the present, so about 1,500 years ago, and 1,400, 1,300 CE, 500 years ago, were two periods of empire in Southwest Asia. And the site of Dhiban was more or less sort of in the periphery at each one. So it was almost autonomous. People were sort of doing their own thing, as some people claim Berkeley does, doing its own thing, which is a good thing sometimes, many times. So what's very interesting is that we can actually compare two different moments in time separated by 600 years. So we can, in a way that when contemporary environmental scientists say like, oh, we're interested in long-term agriculture, 3 decades. Like, well, okay, we could also look at 3,000 years and see whether or not there were actually changes in the historic period when agriculture is an established and sustained way of life, whether or not there are actually changes through time, or if one of the images, the romantic pastoral images of timeless agriculture that you often see in travel brochures to Italy, the timeless peasant, whether or not, empirically speaking, that's actually a model, a tractable model that we should be using. So again, I went into the field and I collected a lot of bags of dirt, as you see here, using a very specific kind of sampling strategy. In fact, I collected 903 bags of dirt, totaling about 8,000 liters. Out of that, I analyzed about 223 of them, so that's 33%, about 2,600 liters of dirt that I sifted and looked through for carbonized botanical remains. The people of the past can thank me later. Unfortunately, they're not able to. But so out of those 223 samples, those bags that I looked at of sediment, I counted about 68,000 different kinds of things in them. And like I said, patience is the takeaway lesson of this. It teaches you the boundaries of your own inner Zen. It's very nice. 37% of these 68,000 things were actually charcoal. So remember, the landscape today, not many trees, but charcoal is actually the majority of what I find. So this is actually probably related to the fact that there was probably more vegetation in the past than there is today. So again, one of the dangers in looking at our contemporary landscape and making these very large claims about what it was like in the past actually requires a lot of this sort of on-the-ground research. Yes?
Is this both time periods?
Yeah, it's both time periods combined, exactly, yeah. So this is just...
You weren't comparing them.
No, not in this chart. This is just like a general description of, but I did compare them, which I'll show in a second. That's a great question, yeah. These are just all the samples from all time periods all together. And so you can see those whole seeds that I showed you before only make up about 18%, and with everything down to, there it is, dung. Aha, see, I knew it would come back here. It always comes back. So I can actually it always comes back to dung in the end in the Middle East. So we can actually take, because we have all different kinds of categories of things, these charcoal seeds. These rachis is actually chaff. We have chaff remains. So this is an example of something that I found in one of the samples, for instance. That's a barley seed actually still in its rachis. It's still in its chaff. So that's the kind of preservation that's actually possible. Not quite, Egyptian whole desiccated garlic cloves, but we're trying here. We're working with what we have. And this is actually the grape, grape pedicel. So if you're taking grapes off of like the little nubby portions, that little nubby portion that you pull the grape off of, that's what this is. So, and that'll actually be important in a second. So these are the kinds of things that we can find. We can actually see very detailed information. And we can actually look within all those 200 samples when we separate it by time period. Here's this early one, 600 CE. This later one is 1300 CE. If we look in each one of these samples and compare the proportions of chaff, like this, the actual crops, the seeds, and archaeological weed seeds, become a virtual weed ecologist. I know a lot about weeds. A lot of them are invading here, very invasive in California. We can look at the proportions of these things together, and what we see is that this earlier period, most of these samples of dirt, the material that I find in them is on the continuum of crops to weeds. Whereas 600 years later, most of the samples contain chaff remains like this or weed seeds. And what that's probably related to is the kinds of things that people were doing and the kinds of practices they were engaged in. So for instance, more processing on site. So one of the questions is, why were they processing on site? Was it unsafe to winnow in the field? If you recall, I showed you the picture. Was it unsafe to winnow in the field? Yes, it was, as it turns out. So we see more crop processing on site, but chaff comes from cereal plants. So it also means that people were cultivating and producing a lot more grain than in the past, where it seems like we've got more crops and weeds. And we can actually see that from the remains themselves. So if you recall, I showed you the different pictures of the seeds themselves. We can look at, for instance, this is how many samples contain at least one seed of this type, so grapes. So what this is saying is that in 600 CE, more than 50% of the samples, half the samples that I looked at from this time period, this earlier time period, actually contained at least one grape remain. Whereas 600 years later, it's less than a quarter of the samples. So it's way less prevalent on the site 600 years later. In contrast, what we can see is what jumps to almost 100% is barley and wheat. And we also see a shift to more chaff in these samples. So what we're probably looking at is actually a shift in production strategy from things like grapes to things like cereals. And there are a lot of, if I had a lot of time, we could talk about what that might mean in terms of what's happening on the landscape itself, deforestation and these kinds of issues, what this might mean in terms of social organization. Is there a question? Yeah, what this might mean in terms of social organization and also the effects of these polities on them. And I'm going to follow that up in a moment, yeah. That's a really tricky question. In this case, I think it's intentionally grown as a fodder crop for animals. Yeah, and by this time, people were quite aware of nitrogen-fixing legumes. And so we actually see vetch and, to some extent, pea being the preferred nitrogen-fixing crops. And also, they're multi-purpose. You can use them for feeding your sheep and goat, and et cetera, et cetera. So to give you an example of how important grape is, I'll show you something really interesting from last year's field season. This is the interior of a room. These are actually the bases for springers for arches. And if you look here, what you're seeing is these are all destroyed storage vessels. So this is a room that was actually, it looks like an earthquake struck the structure. The room collapsed and caught on fire. Everyone made it out. We haven't actually found any human skeletons whatsoever. So it looks like people had some sort of forewarning. And so what we actually have is a record of all the material, all the plant remains that were being stored in this room right up until the moment that it collapsed. And one of the things that I should mention in addition is that for this site, we have no writing. No writing. Even though it's in the historic period, people did not write much about themselves, nor did other people write about them very much. You can draw a lot of analogies to the modern world with that. Graduate students, for instance. These archaeological methods are, in fact, virtually our only way of knowing about this community, these communities that lived on the site during these periods of time. So in this period, 600 CE, about 1,500 years ago, there actually was a lot of writing, but not about this area in particular. So again, we're looking at this collapsed storeroom, and because we actually know the location of each one of these samples, here are the arches, we can actually identify the contents of each one of these vessels. And so what we see is that these two areas where I took these dirt samples from were really filled with grape remains, whereas this was filled with wheat and pea. This is probably an intentional a strategy that's very often used of crop rotation. But it's not just grape remains. They're grape remains actually embedded in grape skins themselves. So again, we've got grapes. These are actually grape seeds embedded in grape skins. And in addition to that, we found them inside of these storage vessels with these long pedicels, the pieces that we take them off of. All together, what that probably is the dregs of wine. Those were probably wine storage vessels. And actually, this is the only concrete empirical evidence we have of wine storage in this period. Everything else actually relies on documentary evidence. But through using paleoethnobotany, we can actually see the direct physical evidence of wine storage in a site that, as you saw, is sort of off the beaten path from a lot of these big, spectacular centers. And that's not the only thing. 600 years later, we see the arrival of cherry pits. Again, not in the written sources, not something that we would expect to see. I was totally shocked, but also really pleased that, again, so in the earlier period, that's when we have wine storage. 600 years later, we find cherry pits. And that actually tells us, again, a lot about people. Where did they acquire these cherry pits? What kinds of cultivation must they have been, they must have been engaging in? The kinds of trade routes that must have existed. And the reason that I talk about these trade routes is, again, remember there's a light fraction, there's all the stuff that floats to the top. That's these carbonized botanical remains, like this cherry pit. And then there's everything that sinks to the bottom. In these samples from this medieval 600-year later period, we find these sort of like alien-looking things in the heavy fraction, that stuff that sinks to the bottom. This is the grinding mill. It's sort of like the lower jaw of a tropical fish, an Indo-Pacific fish known as a parrotfish. Right, so yeah. So you can see here, we're nowhere near the ocean or the Pacific or the Indo-Pacific. But what's really interesting is that we find a lot of these grinding mills in these samples. So 600 years later, from the time in which people were cultivating lots of grapes, maybe not that many cereals, storing wine, there's a whole new there's a different kind of life. Even though they're both agricultural societies, some are growing the same area, people in the same area are now growing cherries. They're now reaching out to trade networks that are very far away from themselves. And we also find lots of fish remains too. So it looks like even a change in diet and the kinds of things that people wanted, yeah.
Do people know where the cherry, like the wild cherries originally came from?
Yeah, so I looked this up. It's actually that's a contentious, no, I don't want to say contentious, but it's a difficult question to answer right now. There's been a lot more genetic research into looking at the different varieties. The problem is that the shape, usually you can actually use the shape of the seeds themselves to distinguish different varieties, but all the different cultivars that we have are so similar, and even from species to species, they are so similar that it's hard to trace down one route. It's proposed that it's someplace in the northern part of Southwest Asia, maybe along what's today southern Turkey, where southern Turkey and Iraq meet. But that's actually a question that looks like it might be resolved with better genetic evidence. So there's still a lot of long-standing questions, which is very interesting. And that's something that the field is still very much vital and alive. Yeah?
In the charcoal did you also find cherry wood?
No, I haven't found any cherry wood so far. Yeah. So that's a great question. Yeah, there's actually no correlation yet between the two. So it looks like it was very much a valued plant, something that you couldn't burn. In contrast, I find a lot of fig wood. So it looks like fig was something that was being probably grown en masse, and then as it was coppiced, because coppicing, cutting is intentional, the people were burning the wood. So that's, again, another great way to think about like what these plants actually mean to people. So in conclusion, what we can see is probably in the 600-year period, more production focused on arboriculture. In the earlier period, 600 years later, cereal cultivation, and then cherry pits and fish. So it's a far different picture from the sort of like static, timeless agriculture that we imagine in the past 5,000 years. But through paleoethnobotany, we can actually learn quite a lot. And I think that that's where the frontier is, all those different kinds of methods that I showed you worldwide, not just in Southwest Asia, but all over the world is probably going to very much change our perspective of all of these issues. So thank you, everyone.
So we have time for questions, and there's a lot of minutes.
I know that this is speculation, but what do you think you're going to find in the last 800 years? 600, 800 years?
Well, so that's a great question. More recently in the past, I think the really interesting stuff is what you're going to see both later today and also tomorrow, the post-Columbian exchange. So after Western European contact with the Americas, the exchange of plants that occurs, I think is a really fascinating question, and something that actually these methods are being employed even as recently as 200 years ago. So for instance, hookah smoking is a very common practice, but we know that tobacco is very much the staple New World crop. So the ways in which that became indigenized into a local tradition, I think, is very interesting. So I would actually expect to see, for instance, tobacco seeds. We find Ottoman period smoking pipes on the site, which means that either they were importing tobacco or growing it locally. We know that they were actually growing it locally down in the bottoms of those canyons, if you remember. So we know that people are having, after they acquire these tobacco plants, they're cultivating them, growing these domesticated varieties. And so I think that that is something that's really interesting, and even thinking about the entire process as to how that happens. How did they come into contact with the first tobacco plants? Where did they choose to grow them? That's one. Some of the other ones that I would expect to see, especially in the past 400 years, tomato, watermelon, again, all this evidence of the Columbian exchange. Not so much potatoes, but definitely tomatoes today. That's a major cash crop in the area. Yeah.
Do you assume that the ethnic identity of the inhabitants of this town has remained constant over these hundreds of years? Or are you thinking that perhaps the ethnic identity, linguistic affiliation of these people has changed several times over this period?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I would say that my hypothesis is that almost certainly it's changed. I think that the direct evidence for that change is we're still looking for that. But there's no question that, for instance, during this earlier period, people on the site probably spoke Greek in some situations, and then a Semitic language, probably early Arabic. And before that, the site is actually famous. I should show you this. The site is famous for this stela that I showed in the beginning. Hold on. Here we go. Everything in reverse. It's a great metaphor for time. Everything backwards. This stela that I showed you is the Mesha stele. It's very important because it dates to about 850 BC. And it corroborates a lot of information in the Hebrew Bible, written in a language that's very similar to Biblical Hebrew. And so that seems to be the language that was spoken about 3,000 years ago in the site. As far as we can tell, I mean, one stela that's just one data point. It's.
See, the reason I ask is, wouldn't you expect that different ethnic groups would be eating different things, and growing different things?
I think that's definitely a really interesting hypothesis that's worth investigating, because sometimes we see that different ethnic groups eat different things, and sometimes we see that different ethnic groups living in the same bounded area actually exchange quite a lot and will have sort of very similar kinds of cuisine. So I think that using this information, we could actually tease out some of those questions. I haven't looked at it from the perspective of ethnicity as much, but I've actually looked at it from the perspective of politics, very specifically, and the political economy and the way that it's affected it. Because we know quite a lot about those historical periods, even if we don't know a lot about what was happening at that particular site here, tucked away in the corner of Jordan, at those moments in time. We know about, in general, the political environment in which it was found. So my questions were very much focused on political economy. But I think that's something that's very much worthwhile. Yeah.
In one of the slides you showed us, it looked like olives were grown, or the remnants were found just in the Byzantine period.
Yeah.
And so to the point of the economic, political issues that you were just talking about, what ideas or conclusions have you come up with that explain why olives were just really confined to that one particular period?
That is a fascinating question. How much time do you have? And how much patience does everyone else have? So the short story is that in between these two periods, so again, I'll just show the sort of. So in this earlier Byzantine period, as you pointed out, the Palynological or pollen evidence shows in this part of the world, there's a huge spike in olive production that then later tapers off. But one of the problems, or I should say, one of the limitations of using pollen evidence is that if you think about pollen, it's just showing you an aggregate picture, because this pollen is released into the air and then it later settles down. So there's a lot of pollen mixing going on, much to my dismay. I never had any pollen allergies till I came to the West Coast, and now I'm like a sneeze machine. Because of all the ambient pollen, it's actually difficult to disentangle or to get a very precise picture of where those pollen sources are coming from. So we're actually just seeing an aggregate of all the olive pollen that was being produced. That doesn't actually tell us which sites or which areas were producing it. It just meant that there was a lot in the area. What I found is in the 600 liters of dirt I've looked at from the Byzantine period, I've only found one olive pit. That's it. However, and thanks again to this, the revolution in flotation that's happened, in a lot of the surrounding sites where they've published their paleoethnobotanical research, they actually do get lots of olive pits. And so at this site, it seems like there's a lot of grape, wine storage, and not so much olive. And at these other sites, there's actually quite a lot of olive, and some there's very little grape. It seems that even though people were part of this very large empire, the communities in this area were essentially, it seems like they were engaged in very extensive negotiations with each other and specializing in certain things and not others. So that's why using each of these different methods together is really important, because the pollen shows, yes, there's olive, but it doesn't actually show us how that played out for each of these different communities. And what we see is that there's some communities that are really investing in olive production, and sites that are just 30, 40 kilometers, communities that are 30, 40 kilometers next door that aren't growing olive at all. Today, the contemporary Beni Hamida who lived there, olea culture is a very important way of life. And it's something that is commercially grown. But it seems like in this period where we'd expect it the most, there's almost none. So that's actually, again, one of the really interesting insights that we could get from using these kinds of methods. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
We eat a melon here that's called the Persian melon. It's like a cantaloupe.
Mm-hmm.
And also I grew up in India, and then there's a stereotype that all the stone fruits and nuts and raisins came from, partly the area you're talking about.
Yeah.
So just, it's a foodie question.
Yeah, and we can actually, so that there's a colleague of mine who's now cries of celebration, tenure track faculty at McMaster, who's actually working on this issue of gastronomic heritage and the way that marketing today is actually taking advantage of the longevity and the cultural meanings of a lot of these plants to so many people, and using it in very interesting ways. So like talking about Inca chocolate, when in fact the Inca were not using chocolate. It was primarily a Mesoamerican product. But so those are just some of the very interesting sort of connotations. There are a lot of plants that are associated with some areas that then later on, because of maybe the predominance of certain groups in their propagation or making them aware to people, become associated with them. So for instance, like tomatoes and Italian cuisine. Most people, when they think of Italian cuisine, they're like, tomatoes, but that's from here. And so things like apricots, we have a general guess that maybe, because the genetics in this are still forthcoming, maybe apples are from Central Asia. Pomegranates are probably from what's the Iranian plateau. Cherries, still unknown. Peaches, probably Central Asia. Plums, more or less this area right here. But we could see, actually, let's see some things like, bananas were actually domesticated in New Guinea. And that's not something, when we think of bananas today, that's not the place in the world that we would imagine them, their locus of domestication being. So there are a lot of different places, peanuts in Amazonia. So the meanings that they're given to, I think that's a really fascinating question, like along the pipeline. But now we're actually getting much better at identifying these origins. If you're very interested, there's something called the Oxford Book of Food Plants. I would really recommend it. It's really very nice. They have more or less sort of up-to-date information on a lot of the origins of these plants. And for more technical discussion, there's the authors are called Zohari and Hopf, Domestication of Plants in the Old World. They're in the 4th edition now. And it's a great book because they just list each different kind of plant. They'll say cherries, here's all the evidence we have, this is where we think it's from, this is how we know it, et cetera, et cetera. But it's very, very technical in some places. But yeah, so we can actually see, I'm trying to see some of the other ones that are often shocking. Yaks are actually domesticated. Yeah, no one ever thinks about that. Yeah.
Dr. Farahani, can you talk a little bit about your path to becoming a paleoethnobotanist? I mean, it's kind of interesting nexus between history and science. I think for a lot of our kids, they're sitting in the classroom wondering, what are we doing here? And,
I was one of those kids once.
Again, I think I found your talk very interesting, and I think maybe if they just saw paleoethnobotanist on a piece of paper, they'd shrug their shoulders.
Yeah, it's a hard sell, yeah. Even 15, I mean, like even 10 years later, 5 years later, when they're college students and theoretically adults, the situation doesn't get any better, unfortunately. Sometimes it does. I actually became interested in this question when I was in graduate school. So before that, like as I mentioned, I had gotten my degree and I double majored. I started off in linguistics, and I became very interested in historical linguistics, in the ways in which that language changes through time and people, and to some extent computational linguistics. But I had been taking a lot of archaeology and history classes as an undergraduate. And then when I got to graduate school, I was really interested, I became more and more interested in agriculture, actually, and looking at things that I pointed out, like agricultural metaphors. I thought that those were very interesting. And then in the place in the world that I became more and more interested in the Middle East, I began to see that agriculture as a kind of way of life and sort of sitting at the nexus of all of these different facets of people's lives was something that seemed to be a very fruitful, pun intended, area of research. And so I was very fortunate that I came to Berkeley because we are one of the few places in the United States today to actually study this. And so I had taken a class called Environmental Archaeology, and that changed my perspective entirely on these kinds of issues. And I said, this is what I want to do. These are the kinds of questions that I want to ask because they really resonate with a lot of the things that I'm interested in thinking about not just people and the things that go on in their head, but also the landscapes that they're part of. And there was probably a lot of ambient influence going on in terms of environmental crises. People are really concerned with sustainability now, with the environment more generally. And so in terms of telling the next generation, I'm going to try to restrain myself. It's become somewhat distressing, in fact, and that's just because of, we all know, a general disinvestment in education, and definitely in sort of niche subjects like this, where increasingly I should mention that my research was funded by the National Science Foundation, and there's actually a push now among some members of Congress, very specifically, to cut funding for projects like this from the National Science Foundation because it's not in the national interest. So we'll see in the next 10 to 15 years how this will play out. And universities are good barometers for this because a lot of these hiring decisions come from the way that funding is allocated. And very often this is seen as it's nice, but whether or not that's the longevity of this as a sort of very active kind of discipline, even though that there's so much potential for future research, is very much up in the air right now. And so to study this, for instance, in the United States, I think especially if you're interested in the Middle East, there's only one place. And it's a colleague of mine who's now, hooray, hired at BU. So he's the only person that is teaching that for the Middle East. Now, if you go to Europe, that's a completely different issue, especially England. They're really doing a lot there. But I would say that students that there's a discipline for everybody, I guess, and that I really liked science. I never really thought about plants, but I also really liked history. And so I found something that combined the two. And that's actually, right now, possible. And so, yeah, I think that in the future, encouraging the next generation to become interested in these issues is actually something that's really important, because then it says, these are actually important topics that we should know about, not only for ourselves, but for everybody, so.
That was a very good question.
Yeah, it's a hard one.
It was excellent. Thank you so much.